He had everything money could buy: private jets that whisked him across continents, designer clothes that cost more than most people's yearly salary, and a surname that commanded respect before he even entered a room. But beneath the polished exterior, 17-year-old Alexander Chen was drowning in a sea of his own emptiness, watching his life crumble one failed test at a time. The marble halls of Riverside Preparatory Academy echoed with whispered disappointments about the boy who had it all but understood nothing. Teachers whispered behind closed doors, classmates rolled their eyes at his arrogance, and even his own father had begun to look at him like a failed investment. Everyone had given up on him. Everyone except a quiet woman in a faded uniform who cleaned the floors nobody else bothered to notice. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now let's begin. Her name was Dorothy Freeman, and she had been invisible to Alexander for 3 years, just another piece of the school's background machinery. But on a particularly bitter morning in November, when his latest chemistry test came back with a devastating 12% scrawled in red ink, something shifted in the universe. As Alexander crumpled the paper and hurled it toward a trash can, missing, naturally, Dorothy was there, methodically mopping the hallway with the same quiet dignity she brought to everything she did. Alexander's father, David Chen, had built an empire from nothing. Starting with a small tech startup in his garage, he had clawed his way to the top of Silicon Valley's food chain, accumulating billions and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. But all that success meant nothing when it came to his only son, who seemed determined to waste every opportunity handed to him on a silver platter. "You're an embarrassment," David had said just the night before, his voice cold as steel. "If you worked for me, you'd be fired within a week." Alexander had shrugged it off then, but the words burned like acid in his chest. At Riverside Prep, Alexander was known for his designer sneakers that cost more than most cars, his habit of arriving in different luxury vehicles each week, and his spectacular academic failures. His teachers passed him not out of mercy, but out of fear of losing the Chun family's generous donations that kept the school's endowment healthy. Alexander knew this, and it made him even more reckless. Why study when your last name could buy you anything you wanted? But that November morning, as Dorothy quietly cleaned up his mess, literally and metaphorically, something in her posture caught his attention. She wasn't servile or embarrassed. She moved with a quiet strength that he'd never noticed before, her weathered hands working with precision and purpose. When she bent to pick up his crumpled test, she glanced at it briefly, and he could have sworn he saw something flicker in her eyes, not judgment, but understanding. "Bad day?" she asked simply, her voice warm despite the cold, institutional fluorescent lighting. Alexander expected to brush her off with his usual arrogance, but something in her tone stopped him. "Every day's a bad day," he muttered, surprised by his own honesty. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully as she continued her work. "Intelligence isn't about the grades you get," she said quietly. "It's about what you do when you realize you don't know everything." She paused, then added with a gentle smile, "And sometimes the smartest thing you can do is ask for help." Those words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He stared at this woman, this janitor, who had just said something more profound than anything his expensive tutors had ever offered. Before he could respond, she had moved on down the hallway, her cart squeaking softly as she disappeared around the corner. That evening, Alexander sat in his palatial bedroom, staring at the chemistry test he'd retrieved from the trash. 12%. The number seemed to mock him from the page. For the first time in his life, he felt something other than indifference about his failures. He felt ashamed. Not because of what others might think, but because he was wasting something precious. His mind wandered back to Dorothy's words, and he found himself wondering about this woman who cleaned floors but spoke like a philosopher. The next morning, Alexander arrived at school early. He found Dorothy in the East Wing, methodically cleaning windows as the sunrise painted golden streaks across the glass. She looked up as he approached, showing no surprise at his presence. "You came back," she observed. "I can't stop thinking about what you said yesterday," Alexander admitted. "About asking for help." Dorothy set down her cleaning supplies and really looked at him, Perhaps the first adult at the school who had ever done so without calculating his family's net worth. "What kind of help are you looking for?" "I don't know," Alexander said helplessly. "I just know I can't keep going like this. I'm failing everything, and I don't understand why. I mean, I know I don't study, but it's more than that. It's like I've forgotten how to learn." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, studying his face with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Learning isn't about memorizing facts," she finally said. "It's about changing the way you see the world. And that starts with changing how you see yourself." Something in her voice made Alexander look at her more carefully. There was an authority there, a depth of knowledge that seemed impossible for someone in a janitor's uniform. "Were you a teacher?" he asked suddenly. A shadow crossed Dorothy's face. "Once upon a time," she said softly. "A long time ago." "What happened?" Dorothy resumed her cleaning, but her movements were slower now, more thoughtful. "Life happened. Sometimes you lose everything you thought defined you, and you have to rebuild from scratch. But you know what I learned? Knowledge doesn't disappear just because your title does. Wisdom doesn't vanish because your circumstances change." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Here was someone who had lost everything and still maintained her dignity, still chose to help others. Could you help me?" he asked quietly. "I mean, really help me, not just with homework, but with understanding. I'll pay you whatever." "Stop," Dorothy interrupted gently but firmly. "If we're going to do this, we do it right. No money changing hands. No special treatment. You want to learn? Then you learn like everyone else should, with respect, with effort, and with humility." And so began the most important education of Alexander Chen's life. Every morning at 6 a.m., Alexander met Dorothy in the old library that had been abandoned in favor of the school's new digital learning center. She had transformed the dusty space into something magical, a sanctuary where real learning could happen. Books that had been forgotten on shelves suddenly came alive in her hands. She didn't just teach subjects, she taught him how to think. "Read this paragraph," she would say, handing him a worn copy of Maya Angelou's autobiography. "Now tell me what you felt, not what you understood." At first, Alexander struggled with this concept. He had been trained to regurgitate facts, not to engage with ideas emotionally. But Dorothy was patient, coaxing out thoughts and feelings he didn't even know he possessed. She taught him that learning was not a passive activity, but a transformative one. "Why do you think this character made that choice?" she would ask about a novel they were reading together. "I don't know. Maybe because the author needed him to for the plot?" Dorothy would shake her head. "That's not thinking, that's guessing. Think about what drove him. Or his fears, his hopes. How do those compare to your own?" Slowly, Alexander began to understand what she meant. Reading became less about getting through pages and more about understanding human nature. Math became less about formulas and more about logical thinking. Science became less about memorization and more about curiosity and wonder. The transformation wasn't just academic. As Alexander began to truly learn, he began to see the world differently. He noticed things he had never paid attention to before. The exhaustion in his teacher's eyes, the loneliness of classmates he had dismissed, the quiet dignity of the maintenance staff who kept his privileged world running smoothly. He began to understand that intelligence and worth weren't measured by bank accounts or test scores, but by compassion, curiosity, and courage. Word of Alexander's transformation began to spread, but not in the way anyone expected. Other students, drawn by his newfound authenticity, began to seek him out. Sarah, a scholarship student who worked 2 jobs to afford her school supplies, asked if he could help her with an essay. Miguel, whose immigrant parents spoke no English, needed someone to explain a particularly difficult concept in American history. Before long, the abandoned library had become an unofficial tutoring center, with Dorothy quietly supervising and Alexander helping his classmates with genuine enthusiasm. But success, Alexander learned, often comes with a price. The administration began to take notice of the unofficial classes happening after hours. Parents started asking questions about why their children were spending time with the help. And David Chun, when he heard rumors about his son's activities, was furious. "You're embarrassing our family," David raged during one of their increasingly frequent confrontations. "Spending time with the custodial staff? What will people think? Maybe they'll think I've finally learned something worth knowing." Alexander shot back, his newfound confidence allowing him to stand up to his father for the first time in his life. The breaking point came during Alexander's senior year. The school board, pressured by wealthy parents who didn't appreciate their children being taught by someone they saw as beneath their social status, issued an ultimatum. Dorothy must cease all tutoring activities immediately or face termination. Alexander was devastated. "This is insane," he told Dorothy after she broke the news. "You're the best teacher this school has ever had. And I always will be," Dorothy replied calmly. "No one can take away what I've given you, Alexander. No one can undo what you've learned. But it's not fair. You shouldn't have to choose between helping students and keeping your job." Dorothy smiled, that same gentle smile that had first caught his attention. "Fairness isn't about getting what you deserve. It's about doing what's right, even when it costs you everything." The next week, Dorothy was gone. Officially, she had been reassigned to another facility, but everyone knew the truth. Alexander felt like he had lost a parent, a mentor, and his moral compass all at once. His grades began to slip again, not because he had forgotten how to learn, but because learning felt meaningless without her guidance. Then came the announcement that would change everything: the annual senior speech competition with the topic, "What Success Really Means." The winner would receive a full scholarship to any university of their choice and the opportunity to address the state education board. Alexander saw his chance not just to honor Dorothy's memory, but to expose the system that had silenced her. He worked on his speech for weeks, pouring his heart onto paper in a way Dorothy had taught him. He wrote about privilege and prejudice, about the difference between education and learning, about a woman who had changed his life simply by seeing him as a human being worthy of growth and compassion. The night of the competition, the auditorium was packed with parents, students, faculty, and local dignitaries. Alexander took the stage wearing a simple black suit. No designer labels, no flashy accessories. Just truth. "My name is Alexander Chen," he began, his voice steady and clear. "Most of you know me as the son of David Chen, as someone born into privilege and opportunity. But for most of my life, I was also someone who was failing at everything that mattered." He paused, scanning the audience until he found his father's face in the crowd. Stern, expectant, slightly embarrassed. "I had every advantage money could buy, but I was intellectually and morally bankrupt. I treated education like an inconvenience and other people like they were invisible. I was, in every way that counted, a failure." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the typical success story they had expected. "Then I met a woman who changed everything. She wasn't my teacher, officially. She didn't have a degree hanging on her wall or a nameplate on her desk. She had something more valuable. She had wisdom, compassion, and the courage to see potential in someone everyone else had written off." Alexander's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Dorothy Freeman cleaned our floors, emptied our trash, and made our school function. But more importantly, she taught me what education really means. Not the accumulation of facts or the achievement of grades, but the transformation of the mind and heart." He could see people leaning forward now, caught up in his words. "She taught me that intelligence without compassion is meaningless, that privilege without responsibility is destructive, and that true success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give back." Alexander's eyes found Dorothy in the back of the auditorium. She had come, despite everything, to support him. Mrs. Freeman was fired from this school for doing what every educator should do: inspiring students to think critically and care deeply. She was silenced because her influence threatened a system that values conformity over creativity, compliance over courage. The auditorium was completely silent now. "So when you ask me what success really means, I'll tell you. Success is having the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's unpopular. Success is lifting others up instead of stepping on them to get ahead. Success is recognizing that the person who cleans your floors might be the one who saved your soul." Alexander's voice broke slightly as emotion overwhelmed him. "Mrs. Freeman, Wherever you are, thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. Thank you for teaching me that learning never stops, that compassion never fails, and that true educators never really leave us. They live on in every life they've touched. The standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. There wasn't a dry eye in the house, including David Chen's. Alexander had won more than a speech competition. He had won his voice, his purpose, and his father's respect. In the days that followed, Alexander's speech went viral. News outlets picked up the story of the billionaire's son who credited a fired janitor for his transformation. Dorothy received offers from universities across the country, speaking engagements, and ultimately, a position as Dean of Student Life at a progressive liberal arts college. Alexander declined every Ivy League acceptance and enrolled instead at a small college known for its social justice programs. When reporters asked why, he said simply, "Because I want to learn how to change the world, not just profit from it." 5 years later, Alexander stood before the cameras at the grand opening of the Freeman Institute for Educational Excellence, a revolutionary school that paired traditional academics with life skills, emotional intelligence, and social responsibility. Dorothy stood beside him as co-founder, her title finally matching her true calling, Director of Transformational Learning. This school exists because one person refused to let another person fail, Alexander told the gathered crowd of educators, philanthropists, and students. It exists because someone saw potential where others saw problems, because someone chose kindness over convenience, wisdom over wealth. He turned to Dorothy, his mentor, his friend, his example of what true success looked like. Education isn't about filling empty vessels with information. It's about lighting fires in hungry minds and nurturing compassion in willing hearts. It's about seeing every student, regardless of their background, their bank account, or their past mistakes, as worthy of transformation. The Freeman Institute became a model for schools nationwide. Students didn't just graduate with degrees, they graduated with purpose. And at every commencement ceremony, Alexander would tell the story of a woman who changed his life not with lectures or textbooks, but with something far more powerful: unconditional belief in his potential to become better than he was. Years passed. Alexander became a renowned educator and advocate for educational reform. Dorothy's innovative teaching methods were studied in universities around the world. And David Chen, inspired by his son's transformation, redirected his company's charitable giving toward educational initiatives that served underserved communities. The boy who had once been known for his failures became a man known for helping others succeed. The woman who had been silenced for doing what was right became a voice for change that echoed in classrooms across the nation. And in a small office at the Freeman Institute, hanging side by side, were 2 framed photographs. One of Alexander receiving his PhD in educational psychology, and another of Dorothy being awarded an honorary doctorate from Harvard University. Below them, inscribed on a simple brass plaque, were the words that had started it all: intelligence isn't about the grades you get. It's about what you do when you realize you don't know everything. Justice, it turned out, wasn't always swift or obvious. Sometimes it came quietly, in the form of vindication earned through perseverance, dignity maintained through adversity, and lives transformed through the simple act of believing in human potential. Sometimes the greatest victory wasn't defeating your enemies, but proving them wrong through the undeniable power of living well. In the end, Dorothy Freeman had been right about everything. Knowledge doesn't disappear when circumstances change, wisdom doesn't vanish when titles are stripped away, and the most important lessons are taught not through curriculum, but through character. She had saved more than Alexander's grades. She had saved his soul. And in doing so, she had created a ripple effect that would transform countless other lives for generations to come. The invisible teacher had become impossible to ignore. The dismissed had become indispensable. The silenced had become the voice of change. And the boy who had everything but understood nothing had learned the most important lesson of all: that true greatness comes not from what you achieve, but from what you enable others to become. If this story moved you, If it reminded you of the power of seeing potential in unexpected places, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that celebrate the quiet heroes who change our world one life at a time. Because sometimes the most important lessons come from the most unlikely teachers, and the greatest transformations begin with the simple act of truly seeing another human being. See you in the next video.